A person may be required to provide relevant information to the authority in section 23.1, and yet in section 23.6, a requirement under this section may not be imposed on an individual. That doesn't really look like it's quite right. So perhaps the government will look at that before we reach report stage today. In the last few seconds I've got on this, I want to just reiterate how much the public need to understand that what we are sacrificing, both economically and in terms of our freedom, is worth it if we are protecting the professionals both in the health service but also in local authorities, in all the caring services that are reaching out and providing that sort of community that we all hold so dear. I am seeing it every day in my constituency, and I want to make sure that we never forget that it's the goodness of the British people that makes all these sacrifices worth it.
Gavin Robinson.
Deputy Speaker, it's a pleasure to follow the honourable member for North Hertfordshire. Madam Deputy Speaker, when I indicated to some constituents and even members of my family over the weekend that I was coming to London today, they thought I was mad. And they think collectively we shouldn't be here. And they point to the information that we give out positively and the leadership that we show and wonder why we're here. But when I reflected that my brother, as a consultant in the NHS, will be going into hospital in the face of those acute difficulties on the ward, and his wife, my sister-in-law, would be doing just the same, and the tens of thousands of members of our National Health Service, not through bravado or machismo, but because they care, will be turning up to work yesterday and today and in the days and weeks that follow. We could do our duty and be here today, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I think it is a tribute to our institutions and our democracy that even though there are parts of this legislation that will curtail our freedoms, it is important that we are here and important that we put on record our gratitude for all of those who are stepping up in this time. The Shadow Secretary of State for Health, Madam Deputy Speaker, did raise parking charges at our hospitals as one point in his contribution. And I raise that today because I think it is totally abhorrent that in the face of such adversity we're expecting people not only to turn up to work at hospital but to pay for the privilege of parking there. Madam Deputy Speaker, I know all of these issues will be devolved and will fall to different trusts and commissioning groups across the country. I want to put on record my appreciation for the Belfast Trust for the decision they have taken to waive parking charges for staff members in all the Belfast facilities, and ask that the South Eastern Trust, who have the Ulster Hospital in my constituency, to take exactly the same measure. Madam Deputy Speaker, we need to be supporting people through this. When I attended a pharmacy on Friday, it could only be described as a war zone. They were asking, why are they left in this situation without sufficient pharmacists? I welcome Clause 4 and the extension that is going to bring 4 new registrants. Madam Deputy Speaker, they were saying we can't sell paracetamol, we've run out. You can't use anti-inflammatories in this situation, but our stores are filled with 100 packs of paracetamol, and yet we're legislatively precluded from breaking those down and giving them to people who need them. He said the government says that we have a home delivery service for getting prescriptions out to those in self-isolation, but it's an unfunded service and it's an overstretched service, and our vans run on diesel and not goodwill. Madam Deputy Speaker, there are huge challenges in every aspect of our society through this crisis that this bill alone will not resolve, but it is an important first step. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to place on record my appreciation for not only the government's engagement with us over the last week, but also the substantive nature of this bill. There's hardly a section within this bill that doesn't replicate provisions for Northern Ireland, for Wales and for Scotland. This is a mammoth task that officials have performed over the last number of weeks, and I think we need to pay our appreciation to them. Can I raise one issue to the Paymaster General that I hope she will be able to give some clarity on 2 specific points? She will know in the bill that at Clause 13 we have continuing healthcare assessments. Section 14, Clause 14, local authority care and support for England and Wales, and Clause 15 for Scotland. There is no, this is the one part of the bill where I can see no corresponding provisions for Northern Ireland, and I raise it for this point, not to raise concern, but there are those out there advocating on behalf of charities and have children who are in vulnerable situations in MenCap and with mental capacity issues who feel that this means they will not get the care they need. Could I ask the Paymaster General just to deal with that concern and respond appropriately to alleviate the concerns? Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful for the time.
Caroline Noakes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And there have been some fantastic speeches this evening so far, including from my honourable friend, the member for High Peak, with a stunning maiden speech. But I wish to go back to the words of the Secretary of State, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, when he said that this virus impacts most the weak and the vulnerable. And he is, of course, right. I support the measures in this bill. They are extraordinary measures that can only be used in extraordinary times, but that, Madam Deputy Speaker, is exactly what we are facing. But tonight I wish to speak for the weak and the vulnerable, and you might expect that from the Chair of the Women and Equalities Select Committee, because I have real concerns about how equalities might be impacted and about how those people with protected characteristics for whom we speak might be affected. And I draw particular attention to the elderly, who we know are the most impacted by this disease, and their needs for care that is appropriate in their own homes at the right time. I speak for the disabled, who of course have the biggest challenges and who desperately need assistance. Now, I appreciate why we have the powers in this bill, but they must be used proportionately and reasonably. I also speak for those from black and minority ethnic background, and of course my right honourable friend the Paymaster General has done some absolutely phenomenal work with faith communities, making sure that funerals can be held appropriately for religions. But I would like to point out that in the gig economy you are most likely to find people from a BAME background working. They're also most likely to be young people. They're also most likely to be self-employed or on 0 hours or sole traders, and we must be particularly cognizant of the impact that there is going to be on those people who we will want, when this horror is over, to be able to bounce back, to be the entrepreneurs who will enable our economy to recover from this difficult period. And I also, of course, am going to mention women. We know that caring responsibilities, Madam Deputy Speaker, falls most heavily on their shoulders. We also know that in areas like childminding, you are most likely not only to find that it is the childminders who are doing the caring, but of course they're providing the support that enables women to go out to work, whether it be in our essential professions at the moment or in all parts of the economy. And if we do not provide support to the childminding sector as well as the early years sector, then when of course this virus is quashed and we are in a position where the economy wishes to rebuild, we need childminders to enable that 50% of the workforce to be able to go back to work. We've done great work over the last few years in making sure there are more women in employment, but we have to make sure that it is possible for them, when this is over, to be able to play. I will, of course, be.
So that's exactly the point, isn't it? The early years sector and the childminders, many of whom are self-employed, another reason to repeat the point that so many have made today, why we need something for this part of the economy.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and he's absolutely right. So I've managed to fit in the childminded sector and, of course, the self-employed in one hit. I wanted also to speak about volunteering and the clarity that is needed. There is a great company in my constituency that run Kimbridge Barn. That, of course, is shut, but they want to enable their staff to go and volunteer, whether it be in the health service, whether it's in the care sector, whether it's as delivery drivers. They have many vehicles, but they want clarity as to whether the 80% salaries that the HMRC is going to underwrite, whether that will be applicable if these people are effectively out working in a voluntary capacity. And I also draw attention to the comments made by my right honourable friend, the member for South West Surrey. He spoke about whether local government officers should be considering planning applications at the current time. I would also argue whether they should be considering implementing or imposing parking fines. These are all areas of regulation which are undertaken by local authorities, which I would suggest at the current time are perhaps far from an imperative. I'd like to pay tribute in the voluntary sector to both the Southampton Volunteer Service and to Unity in Tess Valley, who have done some brilliant work pulling together volunteer bureaus and making sure that those who are going to be in the shielded group will have the support from people in the community who can help deliver their medicines and their essential shopping. There is much in this bill which in ordinary times we wouldn't consider, but can I end with one final plea about parliamentary scrutiny? There is as yet no mechanism for select committees like the Women and Equalities Committee, who have much to scrutinise in this bill. There's no ability at the moment under standing orders for them to meet remotely or by video link or using Zoom or Skype for Business or any other mechanism. I understand that the Leader of the House is to make a statement at some point, and I very much hope that he will make sure that at the very least the Select Committee structures can work at this current time to make sure that measures like this are held to proper scrutiny so that we understand how they are impacting the most vulnerable.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I very much appreciate the spirit of cooperation and purpose that's in the Chamber today. We all want the same thing: for the coronavirus outbreak to be over, for people to be safe, and for our public services to be resilient and well-resourced enough to cope. I believe that in order to achieve that, we do need today's legislation. But we also need to speak the truth. And the truth is, sadly, that we have wasted weeks. Time that could have been spent ramping up testing, acquiring more protective equipment, ordering more ventilators. This emergency legislation is welcome. But more than anything else, decisive government action is overdue. The UK had the advantage of being able to learn from the experiences of China and other countries, and yet to people watching from the outside, too often we have seemed like a nation in denial. Now, we can't change where we are now, but it is only by understanding the answers to those questions that we can ensure that similar errors of forward planning do not cost lives. So let us put that right now, with a clearer and stricter lockdown. I agree with the Labour front bench on that, but crucially with the economic security that will make that possible. And I echo everything that others have said about the importance of underpinning the livelihoods of those who are self-employed. And crucially, and I make no apology for repeating this, we need a much, much clearer, more comprehensive wall-to-wall public education campaign to underpin all of this. The message from our health workers couldn't be clearer. Stay home to save lives. We owe them a massive debt of gratitude, but we owe more than that. As MPs in particular, I believe we owe it to them to listen and model the behaviour that we're asking of our constituents. The clearest way to do that is for Parliament to start meeting virtually and voting electronically, rather than putting staff at risk here and risking sending mixed messages to the rest of the country. Now, I had three very brief points to make about the bill. The first was the point that has been made by many others around sovereignty and democracy, and I am very grateful that the government has accepted the amendments to make sure that this legislation will come back to the House after 6 months rather than waiting for 2 years. It's crucial we have that opportunity to correct any mistakes that could easily have been made in the understandably speedy drafting of this very large piece of legislation. The second concern I have is about what's missing from the legislation, from closing detention centres and safely housing those released, to allowing asylum seekers to work and have recourse to public funds, from preventing utility companies cutting off anyone's water, gas, phones, internet or electricity, to putting real pressure on the insurance companies who are hiding behind the definition of notifiable diseases and refusing to pay out businesses that are forced to close. Powers are needed to make them play fair. The bill should be giving local authorities the power to grant council tax holidays and suspend all business tax payments, with central government meeting the lost revenue. It needs to freeze household and business rental payments across all sectors, again with compensation for landlords for the lost rent, not just for 3 months, but for as long as necessary, and to allow for flexible provision for those at risk from domestic abuse, sexual violence and child abuse. But above all, this bill needs to include those measures to protect people's incomes, not just their wages. So many people in Brighton have raised with me the fact that their concerns are not covered by the government's guarantees so far. As a nation, we are rightly proud of our entrepreneurs, our creators and our innovators. We need to remember that many of them lack all the legal protections of redundancy and other rights that exist to help employees who are faced with a sudden lack of income. They need to be included in the government scheme. The 80% of average wages, something like that, needs to be made available to them as well, and it needs to happen very fast. And my last point is simply that as we go through this crisis, we need to do it in a way that prepares us for the next crisis, which is still there, my friends, the crisis that is the climate crisis. And therefore, the kinds of measures that we put in place, for example, when it comes to choosing which businesses we are bailing out, must also be driven by a concern for the climate and make sure that we are supporting the green economy, not the fossil fuel economy of the past.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have one or two points which I feel I would like to put on the record before this bill goes through. But the first thing that strikes me is that this is an ambitious virus. It's an aggressive virus, and it intends to infect every single one of us, both here in the UK and across the entire globe, unless we do something quite dramatic to stop it. And it doesn't discriminate between rich and poor, old and young, black, white, gay, straight, and it doesn't discriminate on the grounds of nationality. It doesn't respect borders, and the pace at which it's covering the globe is something to behold. And that's why I very much welcome the legislation today, because the pace at which we're delivering these important measures that the government does need to be able to take under executive action is equally as impressive. But there are a couple of concerns that I do have, or a couple of questions I do have for the front bench. I mean, clearly I'm going to support these measures. It's necessary that these type of measures go through, and they go through quickly in order for us to respond as a nation. But the first area is I just wonder, and I did ask this question last week but didn't get a full answer, why it was felt necessary to bring forward a brand new piece of legislation when we do actually have the Civil Contingencies Act on the books already. And it seems to me, looking at this bill, that it could quite comfortably, the measures and the powers could quite comfortably fit within the Civil Contingencies Act. The only reason I raise that is that some of the questions today, and I'm glad we've seen some compromises, are about accountability and about the time frame over which these measures will be enforced. And it seems to me the Civil Contingencies Act says that if a measure is brought forward by a minister, then within 7 days Parliament can say something about it. If Parliament is in recess, then within 5 days it can be recalled from recess and deal with any urgent matters. I only flag it, and I suspect there are good reasons why a separate piece of legislation out with the scope of the Civil Contingencies Act was brought. So this is a very dynamic situation, it's very fluid, and things are changing, I mean, literally on a day-by-day basis. So it seems to me that some of the actions that the government may need to take, and rightly need to take, may have some consequences, some intended, some unintended. So, for example, last week we saw some measures which I suspect will really be incorporated under the powers within this piece of legislation, whereby pubs, restaurants, clubs were told to close their doors. The consequence of that would have been, without an immediate adjustment, that actually maybe 1 to 3 million people would have no money within a week or so. Thankfully, the government was able to bring forward measures which dealt with that, with the majority of those people. And I suspect that there'll be situations in the weeks ahead when the numbers begin to escalate, when we all begin to worry about our own sanity, let alone our own health. There'll be moments when it may be necessary that the military or police services are on the streets and are committed to take actions which will surprise us. And I'm just concerned that actually that the Minister does explain how this House will be able to ask. I'll give way, but very briefly.
Can he just tell me, does he agree with me that all these measures need to be unwound one day and that ministers must keep an eye on how they're going to do so?
I certainly do, and he's put the point very well, and that's the central thrust of what I'm saying. I'd like to say that one of the key aspects of this virus, one of the key reasons why it is so aggressive and so intrusive and so ambitious and so quick to move around, is it may well have the ability to mutate. And if that were to happen, I would like to have confirmation from the government that they feel that within this act, within this bill, they do have the powers necessary to actually ramp up the actions that they're taking within what's been within the wording of the bill. So overall, I very much welcome this piece of legislation, but I would like some clarification about why the Civil Contingencies Act wasn't used, which has been very carefully thought through and has a lot of checks and balances in there. And secondly, I'd like reassurance that were some of the powers under this Act to be deployed on the streets of our country, that Parliament would in some way, I know ministers are responsive, I know the Prime Minister has shown great leadership, and he's looking to do the absolute best for the nation, but that in some way Parliament is able to express, even in recess, that it does have concerns, and concerns over which government ministers and the executive can respond quickly, rather than at the end of, let's say, a 6-month period, a 3-month period, or a 2-year period. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I would like to start where many honourable and right honourable members have also started, which is to put on record our profound thanks to the volunteers and public service workers who have just done so much. I think the definition of the front line is the point of maximum danger, and we know that there are hundreds of thousands of people who have put themselves in danger in order to keep the rest of us safe. There is one group I would like to single out, and that is the extraordinary group of people at Heartlands Hospital in my constituency who have been working tirelessly to help keep our city of Birmingham safe. It was Ernest Hemingway, Madam Deputy Speaker, who said that the definition of courage is grace under pressure. Well, our volunteers and our public service workers are under pressure today like never before. Their skill, their care, their compassion, their grace, their courage, I think, is something that will live in the memory for generations to come. There are two issues that I want to touch on with this bill, Madam Deputy Speaker. Protections that are needed, but protections that are missing. One on the income side and one on the cost side. On the income side, the challenge is now, I think, for Her Majesty's Government to begin quilting together the patchwork of measures that have been so rapidly put into place. There are 5 areas where the income of a household will come under severe pressure very quickly. One is obviously for those who are in work. One is for those who are self-employed. One is for those who are newly sick. One is for those who are newly unemployed. And of course, one is now for those who are having to take parental leave because the schools are now closed. Now, where the government has moved quickly and where it has been welcome is putting in place wage subsidies. That's good. I add my voice to those who are calling tonight for rapid measures to help those who are self-employed. But we also need to address 3 other areas in the income protection system. One is about making sure that the rate of statutory sick pay moves up very quickly to around £160 a week. It is very difficult for people to live on the extent of the pay cut that has been taken just because they are ill. Paid parental leave now needs to kick in from day one, and that has to be something that is now enforceable as a statutory right. And of course, for those now labouring on universal credit, that has got to go up to at least £100 a week. If you're a 2-couple family in my constituency with 2 kids, you will now be £800 a month below the poverty line if you are having to live on universal credit. That is simply not acceptable, and we are going to have to improve that situation. The second area of protection, though, is on costs, and I talked about this earlier in comments made to the Leader of the House. We now have some companies behaving very badly. We have individuals like Philip Green who laid off thousands of staff before the income protection system kicked in. He should be summoned to the bar of this House to explain himself. I now have staff in Topshop telling me that they are being prohibited from circulating the petition that I have launched in order to have him summoned here to explain himself. But the second area where we need rapid protection is, of course, in price regulation. In times of emergency, prices go up. I have been inundated with complaints after Jute's Pharmacy in my constituency raised the price of Calpol from a couple of quid a bottle to 20 quid a bottle. Markets need morals in times of emergency more than any other time, and we now need rapid action to put in place the price regulation that I proposed in my amendment and which has been widely shared and supported by members across this House.
Tobias Elwood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I join others in commending the spirit, the tenacity, determination and the grit of those on the front line, not just those in the health service, but the police and other services, the growing team out there that are trying to keep our country together during these difficult times. I commend the government's work on providing the necessary medical support through mobilising the NHS at the start, the economic support that's come in to support our businesses and indeed the employees, and now societally with support provided to the 1.5 million of the most vulnerable. But ultimately, this emergency legislation is unparalleled in modern times, granting enormous powers to the state and expected to be approved in the shortest of time periods. So I very much welcome the Health Secretary's assurances that this bill, the measures in this bill are temporary, they're proportionate to the threat, only to be used when strictly necessary, and only in place for as long as required to respond to the crises. But as the bill is debated tonight, we should remember that the COBRA meeting is taking place. British nationals are being called back from, who are abroad, called back to the UK, and there is every expectation that there'll either be a national or localised lockdowns. The armed forces has already been mobilised, and the MOD has had planners in various departments for a number of weeks, but we should expect to see more of them providing fantastic assistance to a number of agencies across the nation. We mustn't forget they're also preparing their own manpower and also need to watch our backs, because whilst the national focus is absolutely on the coronavirus, they have a duty to make sure that we can sleep at night, and they protect the skies, our shores, and indeed our seas as well. We must not forget that they have a day job to do, as well as the contribution they give to the nation. But we should also remember that this was a decade, in fact, where we're on track to be one of the most dangerous since the Cold War. Complex and diverse threats remain out there, and a wily competitor will take full advantage of the global turbulence, not least because threats are no longer so much territorial, but also from a cyber and digital capacity as well. But this government has focused on the government's role, the power of the government to tackle the crisis. But as has been repeated again and again in this House, we can and all must do our part in reducing the spread of this deadly virus. Life is not on hold, as some commentators have made. We actually must adjust to a new normal. We must face the reality and understand that life will now be different as we tackle it, but also afterwards as well. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill is unprecedented, but if the powers are used to that full, it's actually because too many Britons continue to ignore the guidelines and are part of the problem and not the solution. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Queen sent more than a message to the nation last week. It was an instruction. Let's change our routine, as the country has done in the past. Everyone must play their